Hello everybody and welcome to the very first tutorial. My name's Chris and I'll be walking you guys through this. This first tutorial is going to be about HTML. What is HTML? And we're basically going to jump right into it, so let's go. And for those of you guys who would like a copy of this stuff, go ahead and check out the documentation. It's going to be posted below, so you guys will have copies of all of this. And so let's focus on our very first section here, which is HTML. What is HTML? HTML is short for Hypertext Markup Language. It's not a programming language. HTML essentially is the language that we use to display, for the most part, text inside of a document or on a web browser. So the HTML essentially is going to be the majority of our text and our content, what's displayed within the browser. When somebody, for instance, when somebody opens up a web browser, what do they see? What content are they seeing? And all of that information is going to be described within our HTML document. So let's take a break from here and go ahead and hop back over here. Now, so what you guys are seeing, this is my website here. What you're seeing is you see some animations and stuff going on. That's more or less has to do with the JavaScript and CSS styling inside of the website. But just for to give you a basic idea of what's HTML, if you look here, you see the buttons that are glowing orange when I hover over them. This is HTML. So when you see custom web design, web apps, all that content was actually written in the HTML document. Even this button down here. Oops, I don't know if you guys can see that, but even this button down here that says menu, all that was written within that HTML document. Now, really, before we jump into writing any code, what you guys are going to want to do is come over to codepen.io. Now, just to explain what this is what's called a code editor. And a code editor is essentially it's essentially an application. In this case, we're using Codepen, so I'll just kind of explain what this is. So Codepen essentially is an application that allows us to write our HTML, you can see over here, our CSS or SCSS, and our JavaScript all in one spot. So this is kind of useful because it's what we call a sandbox environment. So everything's already kind of linked together. And don't worry if you don't completely understand what that means. We'll touch on that some more when we get into it. But this is a sandbox environment. So what you're going to do before we get started is go ahead and go over to codepen.io. And if you don't already have an account with these guys, you can actually set one up. It's completely free. So you would go to sign up and you would create your free account. There's a pro membership, but I want to say it starts at like $8 or $12 a month. I actually have a pro membership, but you guys don't need it for these tutorials. And to get the most out of Codepen, you really don't need it at all. So don't concern yourself too much with it. So we'll go ahead and log in since I already have an account. And then once you've logged in, you're going to see this screen show up. They recently did a little reworking of their homepage, so it's a little confusing, but what we're going to do is we're going to go to create, and then we're going to go to pin. Okay. Now once we've clicked pin, you'll notice that this screen pops up, and this is actually the code editor. So you can customize your icon, and you can see a picture of me right there, and a save. You can do private when you have a membership with these guys. It's a really cool application, and basically what it's allowing us to do is write our code in an area that's really free of the complexity of what's called a file structure. And so the file structure it can be a little bit confusing, but here, just don't concern yourself with that. This kind of alleviates that issue, and that's why a lot of developers use sandbox environments like this to generate small amounts of code, and then you kind of like you would basically kind of take the code from here and drop it into a full code editor, like the open source code editor Atom. That's one that I use. So we'll get into all that stuff. Don't worry about it too much. But for now, we've got our Codepen account set up, and we're just going to basically go here and say Web Tips HTML 1-1. So I'm going to break this up for you guys into a couple different sections so that way it's easier to follow. To follow. All right, so we briefly talked about what is HTML, what is the purpose of HTML. So let's just jump back over here to refresh. HTML, if you look at this green box, is a hypertext markup language, not a programming language. It doesn't add any functionality to the website. Essentially, it's what composes the text. And I'll also say loosely the format of our content and the way that it's displayed. So just like if you were to, and let's hop back over to Codepen, if you were to write out a sentence, if you're writing a paper, you would write out a sentence, right? And if you wanted to indent, you would write out another sentence. I don't know if I'm spelling everything correctly, just typing fast, right? And so we can see over here in our browser, this is displaying, it's by default, HTML is going to display the text that you write. This is not the proper way to actually write text within your file. We're actually going to go ahead and save so it stops asking us to save. And then from here on, it'll actually save automatically. So you can press Control Save to save quickly, Control S. Okay. So basically, once again, your HTML is just the text and the layout of the text within your web browser. And so that'll actually bring us to our next subject here, element. Let's really write some code now. Finally, we're going to be writing some code. So what is an element? An element is what every HTML document is composed of. You remember how I said just a moment ago that writing your code or writing content and text out like this is the incorrect way to write it. What we do inside of HTML is we put our text and our content within an element that's actually wrapped in it as a tag. So essentially, you can really think of these two things as one and the same. And let's go ahead and take a look at what a tag is. So a tag is enclosed data within an element's control. It's within the scope of the element and helps us to determine the relationship to other elements through what's known as nesting. So we won't talk too much about nesting. Let's look at what an element is. So there's quite a few different elements that make up an HTML document. And what do I mean by element? So an element would be something like an H1 document. And this is the heading, or H1 tag, excuse me, or element. And this is the heading element. Now, if we take a look at this, we actually open and close an H1 tag. And what does that mean? So what we're looking at here is we've got some content. Okay. And so what we're looking at is we've got our tag. Our tag is basically composed of these arrows. Okay. And then within the tag, we have this H1. This H1, and that is the actual element. So really, you're not going to see an element without a tag or a tag without an element. You can think of them pretty much as the same thing. So we put our elements inside of our tags. Okay. And then we put our content within our tag. So you'll see here we have the H1. Oh, I'm moving stuff all around. So here we have our H1 tag with this open and close arrow, okay, or greater than, less than sign, whatever you want to call them. And then within those, we're going to place our content. Now H1 is a pretty basic tag, but it actually goes down. Like this. So if you look and see, we've got our H1, our H2. This will go down to H3 actually, or H6. So what's actually happening here is our heading tag is essentially giving a predetermined font size to our text. And as you can see over here in the browser, this is what we would call the browser, the area that's displaying the information that's going to be on our web page. We can actually get a better view by going here to live view. Let's save, make sure it's saved, and then it'll display here. So here we see our H1, H2, H3, and H4, our heading tag. And all these do is basically give you, like I said, a predetermined font size to the text as you're entering it. You can actually change the font size, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But just to give you an idea of what a tag is, where the content goes, this is a heading tag, and usually you only use maybe H1 to H3, depending on how you like to write your code, which you'll develop as we go. But that's pretty much how it works, guys. You've got the tag, the open tag, and then in order to close the tag, you actually have to put this / in there. So make sure that you remember to do that. It's absolutely imperative. If you do not close the tag, the document won't really know what you're trying to say. Okay, so in Codepen, nothing may not change, but if I was to maybe put that in the wrong place, it might do something crazy. Who knows? I don't know. Okay. So just make sure that you're closing your tag with that / right in front of it. And so just again to touch on what we've done so far, guys, we just basically created an H1 element tag, and then we put some content within there to display inside of the browser, and then we close our tag. And so essentially that's for the most part what makes up an HTML document. Now what's amazing about this, guys, and a lot of people get a little deterred when they're writing code, just try and remember that HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all these languages are written in the human language. It's actually it was designed to allow computers to understand what we want them to do. So we're giving these instructions. Naturally, we're going to give them in a language that we can easily understand. So, and there's a ton of different tags. I'm going to put some in the description for you guys to take a look at. That way you can just kind of see what other tags are out there. We're going to touch on a few more here today to kind of get us going and get us started. So far we've looked at the hypertext markup language, which is HTML. We know that makes up for all of our content within the browser and within our document. And we've also looked at an element. An element is what every HTML document is composed of. They're the essential items and or keywords enclosed in tags. So that makes it a little easier to understand what we're talking about. And then a tag is just really those opening and closing or greater than, less than signs that consist of the actual element itself. So these are pretty much one and the same. The tag and the element are essentially the same thing. Okay. And so that brings us to our next topic here. The basic HTML file or HTML document structure. Okay. So this is extremely important. Every single website that I've done, that I've designed myself, every document that you're going to look at on the internet is going to have this basic structure. Excuse me, goodness. So this basic structure here, and we just refer to it as the basic HTML structure, HTML document structure. I'm not sure if there's really a name for that, but if there is, leave it in the comments, let me know. So anyways, what are we looking at here? We touched on, what's an H1 tag, how to actually write a tag. So we can see here we have a couple tags, right? We have the doc type. Now, this is extremely important. This is going to be at the beginning of every single HTML document that you write, doc type HTML. And this is essentially the document. This is basically expressing to the computer that this is going to be an HTML document. Okay, so nothing too confusing there. And then right below that, we have the HTML tag. Now you'll see it's being closed way down here. What's up with that, Chris? Why the heck is that way down here? I thought we were supposed to close them up here, like this. No, that's not actually the case, guys, and I'll tell you why. It's actually due to what we call in the industry nesting. So as you'll notice, all of this content is actually within this HTML tag. So technically, this is the content inside of the HTML tag itself, the HTML elements, whatever you want to call it. And so this information, or excuse me, this HTML tag is essentially just explaining that this is the content that's within the HTML. So everything that's inside of here is going to be HTML, okay? Not everything, but we'll touch on that a little bit later on. We get into some more complex things like writing some JavaScript. So we'll notice directly below the HTML, we have the head. And if you think about an HTML document, kind of like an essay, or how you used to write an essay in school, where they would say, well, you have to have a heading, you have to have a title to let everybody know what it is that they're reading about. And then you have to have the body, and the body is composed of paragraphs and things of that nature. It is the same exact way inside of an HTML document. So let's bounce back over here. Now that we know what our basic file structure is, we'll go ahead and plug that in. So we've got doc type, make sure you capitalize this, doc type HTML, and that's lowercase, okay. Then we've got our HTML tag that comes after. We'll go ahead and close that, and then you'll see what happens here. Okay, now we're going to do what's called nesting, and it's a very simple concept to understand. Essentially what's happening is this content that we're placing within the HTML tag would be considered to be nested within it. Now, if it was content like an H1 tag, we wouldn't really consider the content in here to be nested. Rather, if it's nested, it's an element or an entire element within another element, the HTML tag, okay? So essentially, this H1 would be considered the child of this HTML tag. And hopefully that makes sense to you guys. If not, you leave me a comment. I'll be sure to try and break that down a little bit further for you. But it's really simple. What's happening is we're just nesting within this HTML tag another tag or element, the H1 element. Okay, so let's get rid of that. So to continue down our file structure, we've got the head. Go ahead and close it. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of an indent happening. That is important. We'll talk about that in a second. So far we've got our HTML tag. It's open there, closed there, and then nested within that, we've got our head tag. Now, what's the head? Okay, the head is exactly what you're thinking it is. It's the header. It is, in this case, this is the information that's actually not going to be displayed in the browser. So what do I mean by that? Well, even though we may put some content in here, like first, let's say the title. Title is where it goes in the head. Okay? So we've got a title, but if we write our title in here, nothing shows up in our browser. And the reason for that is because the information inside of the head tag or head element, header, heading, whatever you want to call it, that information is essentially the defaults or presets for the rest of the information that's going to be in our document. So basically here, we might have a link. And our link might be to a CSS document. Okay, so, and again, none of this information is going to render in the browser. By render, we just mean show up. So none of that information is going to be displayed in the browser, but it's in the background letting this document know what the defaults, presets, and title of this document are. We'll get into that a little bit more once we talk about attributes. But for now, that's all we need to know. Don't focus too much on all the extra information that you're seeing here. In fact, let's go ahead and get rid of this. Okay. So we've got our HTML document. We've got which we've described here. We've got our HTML tag, open and closed. We've got our head inside of our HTML document. What now? We've got a title. And of course, the title is, even though this doesn't show up in the browser, typically it would actually show up in the tab. So all this information, now Codepen's a little different like I've been explaining. So it's going to render in the tab this title here because that's just the way Codepen is set up. But if I was using an open source code editor or another proprietary code editor, this is actually what you would see in the tab. Okay, so they are the same, I think, because I named them the same, but even if I were to change this, you'll see it doesn't change what's actually in the tab here. Fair enough. All right, so now we've got our head. Now we're going to go actually between the closing head and the closing HTML tags, excuse me. And we're going to create the body of our document, okay? So we're going to open and close. And all I'm doing to do that quickly, guys, is I'm just typing out body and then hitting the tab key. And Codepen hasn't built within it what's called a snippet. So the snippet actually automatically opens and closes the tag for you. So if I wanted to just show you that again, I would go body, tab, and it opens and closes it for me. Okay. And we'll see we've still got our indentations. Now I actually want to talk about this before we go any further. We have what's called a nesting system within this HTML document that holds true throughout our CSS and JavaScript. There's nesting and children and parents. So let's take a second to look at this and really try and evaluate the structure and what's happening here. So first of all, we've got our tags. Then we've got child tags or children that are within that main tag, right? And then we've got other tags that are within these tags, and it's all kind of getting a little bit confusing. Now imagine what it would look like. Actually, I could probably do this. Ooh, no, can't do that. Imagine what it would all look like if it was all straight up and down like this. It's a little harder to understand what's going on. We can't really see too well that this is where the HTML document starts, and we can't really, I know what I'm looking at here, but to the untrained eye, it'd be difficult to tell that title is nested within the head. Does that make sense? So essentially, we do this thing, these indents like this, to let us know what's nested and how it's nested, how it's associated with the other tags. So here I've got my HTML open, and then I've got my head, but because the head is nested within that HTML tag, I give it that one tab indent. So that's actually not a space, it's a tab. Okay, so I give it that one tab indent, and then because I've got my title nested within my head tag, I give it that extra indent, and it kind of works that way all the way down. So sometimes you'll see tags indented all the way over here, and that's because you'll see nested elements going all the way down in this diagonal kind of shape, all the way down until the tags start closing. And so the purpose of that is really just to make it easier for us as web designers and web developers to really understand what's going on within this document, to be able to understand visually the nesting and parenting that is happening within this document. Okay, so let's take a step back here and just kind of down our page here. Okay, so aside from that, we've gone over our H1 tag. We've also got the P, or the paragraph tag. Okay, and as you I'm sure you can begin to conclude that this P tag will just render out a paragraph. So let's put it to the test. So we're going to open our P tag. We're going to close it, that slash. And then inside of our tags, we're going to put some text. And so just to give us some dummy text, we can actually just say lorem. Some of you guys might be familiar with this. And then tab. And that'll actually give us a predetermined amount of text. It's random text. It's actually Latin, for those of you guys that don't know. I think it's Latin or Greek or something like that. It's Latin. We can say specifically how many words we want to have. We can say lorem. Let's go lorem 20. That'll give us 20 words. We can say lorem 50. That'll give us 50 words. Okay. So for now, we'll just do something like 20. Okay, so we've got some dummy text, and we can see that it's rendered as a paragraph within our browser here. So we can see that. And we can actually add as many of these as we want. And we'll see that because we gave it a little space here, the browser will give it a space here. But that's not the case as we begin to want more and more indents. We just don't see them translating over into our browser. Okay, and that's because the browser doesn't really recognize what we call white space. Okay, and all white space is it's space, kind of like these indentations that we give. It's similar in that the white space just allows us to visually be able to see exactly what's going on in our document. It makes it easier to read. and just makes it more well organized. So there's not a bunch of binary 10111111 happening all the way down the page. Okay. So by default, the paragraph, as we can see, we got rid of that white space we had. This bit of white space here, I'll highlight it for you. So even if we get rid of that and we put them right next to each other, we can see it's still rendering with that space in between in the browser. And that's due to the fact that the paragraph tag has a default space or margin, and we'll talk more about that later. But it just basically has a default margin. So what we like to do is go ahead and write out our first paragraph, and then you can give it that extra little indent so you can see there's 2 paragraphs here, but you don't really need to. And just as a little trick of the trade, if we wanted to just manually add some more breaks in here, we could say /br. This is what's called a self-closing tag. And this tag just puts a break in between, an extra space, if you will, an extra line space between the text, these 2 tags. So we can see here we've got that additional space that has opened up between our 2 paragraph tags. Okay. All right. And just the same, we can add as many of these as we want. And we can just keep adding them. And it's just going to keep breaking up our lines, breaking them up. Now these would technically be in a row because we already know our file structure, or excuse me, our HTML document structure, our white space and nesting determines that we should have them all straight down. Okay, because they're not actually nested within anything, with the exception of everything that's parented above it. So here it's actually nested within the body tags. Okay, all this information, all this content is nested within those body tags. Okay, so we've learned some interesting stuff so far, guys. We've touched on the basic structure of our HTML document. Let's go ahead and get rid of these line breaks. We've talked a little bit about tags and elements and what nesting is, how we can have elements nested within other elements. So here we can see our head tag is nested within our HTML document, as is all the other content. We can see some nice clean indentations so we can visually see what's going on within our HTML document. We can see some content within some tags. So we've got some content here inside of our title. We've titled it Web Tips HTML. Let's see. We've got our body tag, which is all the information that's going to be rendered within our browser. So this is all the information that we can see inside of the browser. And then we've looked at some basic tags like the paragraph tag, the header tag, or heading, whatever you want to call it. Header tag. We can see that there's a little bit of a change in font depending on what tags we're using. And we learned a little bit about some quick snippets. Go ahead and let's, for an example, we'll rewrite the body tag here. Press tab. That gives us a quick, that actually generates our opening and closing tag pretty quickly. We've learned about lorem tab. And that'll pretty much conclude it for this lesson, guys. Join us in the next tutorial for some more in-depth HTML document structure, a few more tags, and a little bit more information in depth on what HTML actually is. So I'll see you guys next time.